in a small provincial town in Russia, in an ordinary 5-story concrete apartment building, often called a Khrushchevka, there was nothing remarkable. It was a typical neighborhood on the outskirts of an industrial city, where all the buildings looked the same. On the third floor, in a small living room, a 13-year-old boy started watching The Lord of the Rings on a VHS player with admiration. He dreamed that one day he would become as strong and mighty a warrior as Aragorn. Adventurers did await him, but they would be nothing like their fire. That boy was me, short in stature, yet harboring pretension of greatness. At school, I was the smallest of the boys. During physical education classes, when we were lined up by high, I invariably ended up at the very end of the line. For some reason, the tallest girl in the class was always placed next to me. To this day, I don't understand why that was necessary. Perhaps it was meant to make the contrast between dream and reality more obvious. I didn't have much strength either. When it came time to do pull-ups, I would simply hang from the bar like freshly washed laundry, swaying in the wind, never rising above the weight of my own body. Probably that's why, while watching The Lord of the Rings, I so eagerly dreamed of becoming strong one day, like those warriors who never doubted themselves. Back then, it seemed to me that being short was a sentence, that physically I would never change. If I couldn't become strong in body, then I would have to become strong in some other way. I decided that I would be so intelligent that I could control those who had physical superiority over me. In my fantasies, I often saw myself as a major businessman, a man with money, influence, and, of course, an impressive security details that would always be nearby if needed. It seemed to me that power was the most reliable way to stop being afraid. As you might guess, I was much better at fantasizing than at doing pull-ups. I no longer remember exactly where I got the VHS castle of The Lord of the Rings, but I think a friend gave it to me. I had seen clips of the film before, so I had a raw idea of what awaited me. As I walked home with the castle, if it felt as thought my school bag held not a plastic case, but a promise of something great. I couldn't wait to get to my room and turn on the TV. Only my mother was home. She fed me lunch. Casually, I mentioned that I had brought a movie and suggested we watch it together. Still, I already knew she would refuse. She didn't like films like that. Mom went into the kitchen to prepare something for tea so that I could watch, like in a movie theater, and I went into the living room to get everything ready. If you have ever been in a Khrushchevka with light cosmetic renovation from the 19th, you can probably easily imagine our living room. It wasn't isolated. At the far end, there was a door to my older sister's room. The double wooden doors with many small panels were fitted with ripped glass through which one could only guess at seal houses and movement on the other side. So the right of the entrance stood what was known as a Swedish wall unit, a practically point of pride and the dream of almost every family of that time. Bulky, nearly 2 meters tall, it consisted of several sections. At the bottom were closed cabinets. Above them, deep, open shelves so spacious that, as a child, I imagine you could lay a baby there like in a crib. Above that began the main part of the unit. One of side were open shelves with books, collections of Russian classics and several Christian publications. On the other were glass shelves behind transparent doors where the most valuable items were kept. A large festive dinner set. It was taken out only on special occasions. The rest of the time it patently gathered dust. Touching it without my mother's permission was strictly forbidden. To the left of the entrance stood a couch. During the day, people sat on it, watched TV and received guests. At night, it turned into my bed. There was just enough space for one adult. A second would have had to endure tight quarters. Opposite the couch, on a low-ploughed cabinet, stood the television at the center of the room and essentially the focal point of the entire family. Behind it was a large window spanning almost the entire wall. The wallpaper was slightly yellowish with a subtle floral pattern. The light from the ceiling fixture also had a yellow tint, so at times it felt as though a lingering sunset always hung in the room. That's everything. I tightly drew the dark curtains so that not a single ray from the street could break inside. I wanted the living room to become entirely mine, a separate space where reality temporarily retreated. I took out the castle and, feeling almost a ceremonial anticipation, turned it on the TV. It wasn't very old. My mother had brought it from Germany just a few years earlier. It had been passed on to us by my aunt, who had moved there with her German husband when that became possible. The TV was color and had a remote control, something that seemed almost luxurious to me. In our living room, it looked like an object from a singly more prosperous life. I connected the VCR and began adjusting the image. I was good with technology. I even helped accountants figure out their TVs, so connecting the cables and setting the correct mode posed no difficulty. In that, perhaps, I felt confidence, a rare and pleasant sensation. If you ever watch movies on VHS tapes, you remember that state of anticipation. The first seconds when the image trembles, lines run across the screen, the sound seems to stumble, and then suddenly everything stabilizes. The world on the screen assembles itself into a clear form as if deciding to exist. Before pressing play, I turned off the light. The room sank into a soft half-darkness. The couch was unfolded, but I sat on the floor close to the TV. It was easier to see and hear that way, and perhaps closer to what was happening. I took my tea, closed the door, pressed the right button on the remote, and the fantastical world slowly began to fill everything around me. At the time, I didn't yet know what it was searching for in those films, but I clearly felt that something was missing from the ordinary room. Everything around me was correct, familiar, orderly, and at the same time somehow too defined. There was no space left for a miracle. The world opening on the screen was different. It was filled with an expectation of an event. There, even the most insubstantial hobbit small, endowed with neither strange nor special importance, could become the center of the story. This realization affected me almost physically. If he could be important, then I, at least theoretically, could be as well. When Aragorn first appeared, mysterious wonder of restrained strange, a man who possessed the right to command but did not rush to use it. I didn't yet understand why he attacked me so much. But even then, a quiet decision arose within me to be like him. Throughout the entire trilogy, I imagined that he was me. In reality, I was short, insecure, and often afraid to show myself. There I became a man who simply did not use his strength. Not because it wasn't there, but because it was under control. Perhaps it was then that I first decided that strength does not have to be visible. That thought seemed noble. Later, it would become a convenient explanation for why I didn't need to be physically strong. I seemed to justify my own weakness in advance by giving in the form of restraint. I was sitting on the floor, not just in front of the TV. I was alone with my fantasies. The room disappeared. I was impressed, and that world completely without remainder. Tolkien's world ceased to be only his. It became mine. There was room it for miracle, calling and hiding significance. There, behind everyday life, something greater was always expected. There even fear had meaning. When I had already watched more than half of the first part, the silence was broken by the sound of a door opening. My stepfather had returned. He came from work, entered the living room, and stopped at the doorway. For a while, he simply watched the screen, trying to understand what was happening. He couldn't understand who all these people were and why they were going somewhere with such serious expressions. I felt a single irritation, not toward him personally, but because the world I was in suddenly demanded explanations. It was whole, closed, almost sacred. I didn't want to translate it into the language of everyday commentary. So I suggested rewinding the film to the beginning. So it's not to retell, not to simplify, not to take it apart. I thought that if he saw everything from the very start, perhaps he could enter this world himself, and then we would watch it together. He was the most ordinary Soviet man, not evil, not cruel, but not inclined toward excessive softness either. He worked as a welder at a past factory, sometimes taking side jobs. He was short, about 160 centimeters tall. He dressed simply, plain, slightly baggy clothes, as if bought to grow into, but which had simply remained everyday wear. His hobbies were predictable: fishing, the dacha, gathering with friends. Religion remained something distant and foreign to him. On Sundays, when my mother and I went to church, he either went about his own business or left for the dacha. In warm weather, this was almost a rule. Sometimes he met with a friend and returned home tipsy, with a heavy step and short phrases. He was a man who wanted everything to happen according to his own sense of what was right. When he argued with my mother, he demonstratively packed his things into a bag and said he was leaving. Sometimes he really did go to the dacha and with a kind of stubbornness dug over the garden beds as if the earth could accept his irritation better than people. And yet he was real, unlikely the heroes who inspired me. It's not that he was a bad person, no. Rather, he was a man of his era. The harshness of the time in which he grew up could be felt in him. He looked brutal, could swear sharply, smoked strong filtered cigarettes. He had a motorcycle, an obligatory attribute of male independence for that generation. In some sense, he really did resemble characters from Soviet films. Tactical resilience, confident in their right to live as they saw fit. But such heroes almost always had one future. The family exists somewhere on the periphery of their interworld. It was more background than center. And perhaps that it was I was drawn to fictional images. There was something different in them: nobility, inner integrity, a sense of calling. Their strength did not reduce to righteousness. There was dignity in it. I wanted to believe that a man could be strong and at the same time attentive. After he entered the living room, my world ceased to be only mine, it had to be shared. However, this didn't last long. By the middle of the second film, he was already asleep. His head tilted significantly to the side, his breathing became heavy and even, and I was once again alone with my world. Only his quiet, intermittent snoring occasionally reminded me that there was someone else in the room. By the time my mother had long since gone to bed, she had to get up earlier. She worked at the weather treatment facilities. But before the collapse of the Soviet Union, her life had been completely different. She was a high-voltage electrician and took part in the commission of a substation. She was even writing about it in a newspaper. My father carefully kept the photograph from that article after their divorce. I was 4 years old then. My mother always took care of me. I was her fifth child, and perhaps that was why She tried to give me more attention, as if she feared I might get lost among the older sons. There were no swords or loud words in her strain, only early mornings and responsibility. In that silence, when all the adults were already asleep, I was left alone with my world. No one could prevent me from watching into the end. There were enough people around me, then family, accountants, classmates. And yet, I felt lonely. Not because I wasn't loved, but because no one knew what was happening inside me. And talking about it in our family wasn't customary. Feelings were not discussed. They were simply lived through in silence. And then the the battles are over. Arjun accepts the crown. He becomes king and is united with a woman who carried her love through years of waiting and separation. That image struck me no less than the battles. A man who remains faithful, a woman who remains near, love that endured time. There was something in this more powerful than a sword. I wanted to capture that image for myself. I wanted to believe that one day I too would meet such a girl, faithful, calm, the one who would become a lifelong companion. But along with that, fear was born. What if she leaves? If she betrays me? Does it mean I am not strong enough? That there is nothing in me of what he had? The screen went dark. The music fell silent. The fairy tale world dissolved into darkness. And reality gradually began to return. The walls, the cabinet, the curtains became visible again. I could hear my stepfather's breathing. Somewhere beyond the wall, my mother was sleeping. And I sat on the floor, an ordinary boy from a small town who did not know exactly who he should live next, but already felt that he had to become strong. Not necessarily in body, but in mind, definitely. Perhaps it was that very night that the thought first across in me that this town was too small for my future plans, that one day I would have to leave for the big world where there are opportunities and where strength is measured not only by physical superiority. That voice was me. My name is Anatoliy.terekhin, and this is the first chapter of my book, The Weakest. You can buy all the book from the Amazon. Read the description. Link in the description. Thank you guys for listening, and see you on the next video.